I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk about goals. And I'm going to talk about the evolution of our industry and really, I got to make sure I know how to do this, how I think we're at a point where challenging some of our decades-old assumption about recycling. And it really has to do with looking broader, looking bigger, thinking about the change that's happening in the world around us and what it means for recycling and what it means in terms of changing our environmental goals. It's an evolution in how we think. Okay, there we go. First of all, briefly, we are the largest, as I said already, recycler in North America. We recycled 14 million tons of material last year. We have over 100 facilities across the country, and we have invested over $1 billion with a B dollars in recycling infrastructure over the last decade. So with that in mind, we have a lot of investment in recycling. We have worked with customers I've talked about, from municipalities to corporations to states, regulators, NGOs, et cetera. We have a lot of goals out there. We've set recycling goals. Our cities, our customers all have recycling goals. So I look back, I've been in the industry for 30 years, and we started setting goals 30 years ago. We set them by weight, right? Recycling goals, we almost always have weight-based recycling goals. And as we started to look at recycling, we figured recycling is a good thing, so recycling more must be a better thing. So we found these really aggressive recycling goals have been developed by our customers over the years. And we have them too, by the way, at our own company. We have 50%, 75%, 90%, 100% or zero waste recycling goals with our customers across the country. So fast forward to today. Technology's changed, society and demographics have changed. We have a lot more knowledge about the waste stream and about the material that we manage. So with these changes, we're actually now at a point where we're being forced to really challenge some of the premises that we've held for decades and decades. And I like to say, people like me who have gray hair, it's kind of time for us to retire because we've invested so much in a way of thinking. It's really hard to change how we're thinking. I think you'll see that as I talk through and give some examples today. It's time for a change, and it's not easy. It can feel complex. It can be really hard to do, but I hope you'll see today, I don't think it's impossible. I think we've got some great challenges to overcome, that we can use some significant knowledge that we've gained to really look to the future for sustainable materials management in the future. So this map, I gotta look to the right place here. Where am I? This map, I think, is a good one. I actually created it for a completely different purpose, but it really, I think, makes a really good point. So start out by looking at the states, and a lot of them have percentages on them. Those are states that have recycling goals. Then you look at the light green states. Those are states that have organic yard waste bans. And then you have dark green states. Those are states with food waste bans. And you have some purple states, those that have some exemptions. The point being that most of the states that have yard waste bans are in states that have recycling goals. So then next thing you do is look at the little call-outs, mostly on the West Coast there. Those are cities that have aggressive recycling goals. Those are all in states with recycling goals. Then you look at the red stars that are in the cities that have recycling goals, that are in the states that have recycling goals. The point is, those places with goals tend to make programs, and they tend to do better. They have more recycling than they do, which means it's really important that we set the right goals. And I think that's really what this is about, is thinking about the goals that we've set over time. So what about those cities that we talked about that have high recycling goals? This is a graph put together by some of my friends at RRS Consultants. They picked out some of the largest cities in the United States, and they looked at the recycling goals that they have. Mostly they're 75%, 90%, and 100% recycling goals. Now look a little more carefully at this graph. You can see that very few of them have even reached our national average of 34% recycling. So what's the deal? Why is that? Why is there such a gap in what our goals are and what reality is? Well, I have a consultant friend of mine who says there's only one thing that all organizations or cities and states that have recycling goals have in common. Every single goal ends in a 0 or a 5. It's because they didn't use the data that Jeff talked about earlier. They're done for political reasons. The information goes to a city council or goes to an elected body, and they say, well, we want to be better than the cities around us. We want to be better than the other states are. So they create these recycling goals that aren't based on fact. They're really based on more aspirational goals of what they would really like to see. So as the waste stream has shifted, we have a lot more lighter material. The chances that cities are going to get to those really high goals is shrinking, quite frankly. So this is another information based on the study that RRS did, which I think is really sobering. So if you look at the column on the left, that is, what is that, light blue maybe, or gray? Those are the materials in the waste stream. It's about 34% of the materials in the waste stream that are your traditional recyclables, the stuff that we all put in our recycling containers at the curb, bottles, cans, papers, et cetera. Then you look to the green column. That's about 20 to 30% of the overall waste stream, and that's food waste and yard waste for the most part. So if you add those two together, you get 50 to 70% of the waste stream that is recyclable given the programs that we have right now. And that's if we do it really, really well. We get all of it. Then you look to the middle column there, and you'll see the challenging materials. Those are little things. Those are things that right now we can't recycle because we really don't have the technology to recycle them. And then on the far right, that column around manageable, 20%, that's stuff that's really not recyclable. It's hazardous waste, it's too little, it's a lot of laminated sort of things. So in effect here, what we show when we really dig into the stream and become practical about it, we've got 30% of the waste stream we can't recycle. So how are we going to get to those 75%, 90%, and 100% recycling goals? Now, when we talk about industry, often that's a different world because you have often very homogeneous waste streams. But when we're talking about community recycling programs, they're very heterogeneous. And really, we have about 30% of the stream that, quite frankly, is not able to be recycled. And it's not going to get better. So let's talk about what's going on in the world around us. This is changes in society, changes that are happening with packaging. First of all, I'll start out with demographics. Baby boomers, us, me. I buy things differently. Our kids are gone. We have a lot of little packages in the refrigerator that package things really differently. We come home and I need to be able to pull it off easily, put it in the microwave. I like food done differently than I used to. It comes in different packages, and the packaging industry is very, very nice to adjust their packaging to my purchasing desires. Millennials, they buy things a lot differently. They grew up with pouches. Those of you who are in the room, you grew up with pouches and drink boxes. I always say my kids, I don't think they own can openers. They're not wed to the same sort of packages that we used to be growing up. And then I think the most important thing of all in this message is convenience rules. I read an interesting article last week, and it was about cycles versus linear changes. And when we get to convenience and packaging, the changes are linear. They're not cyclical. They're not circular. We're going to continue to see changes in packaging that become more convenient because really, at the end of the day, convenience rules. We're not going to go back to tin cans with can openers, et cetera, or glass bottles for everything. So the materials coming into our home are really, really different. Thus, the materials and the packaging going out of our home look really different as well. So what does this look like then in terms of packaging? This is a great slide. I've got two slides here that really tell, I think, an important story. On the far left, you'll see the red items. Those are all the types of packaging that we're using less and less and less of over the years, over the last 20 years or so. That's glass, it's metal, and it's paper. And then on the left, on the right, are all the things, the packaging substrates that we're using more of. And they are virtually all plastics, except on the far right, which is cardboard. And we know why that is. That's e-commerce, and that number is expecting to grow. It's coming in through curbside recycling programs where it used to come through warehouses in other days. So it looks different in terms of how the system works. But other than the cardboard, it's every single one of those types of packaging that's increasing is all plastic. Now, this is the slide that really was my aha moment. I've been doing this for a long time. And when I saw this slide, I was like a little embarrassed that I hadn't thought about it before. So if you look on the far left, this is the same exact slide, the same materials. The actual recycling rates of all those commodities are in this slide here. And what you see is all of those packaging types that are declining in use are the ones that we're recycling the most of now. And all of the material on the right, which is growing in the use in products and packaging, we're not recycling. Some of them aren't recyclable, so it's zero, or we have very low recycling rates. So this is why we see such a heavy lift right now when we talk about recycling, because we're changing the materials that we're using to things that right now either aren't recyclable or are very low recycling rates. Thank goodness for cardboard. So this is a little bit more on what the packaging and the products look like. And most of this isn't new news, but I have a couple of points to make in doing it. One, certainly we see 50% less newspaper in the waste stream. What's really interesting, I read, or I heard somebody talk the other day, by 2025, we're projected to just not even include newspaper as one of the materials that we talk about, not even going to be around. We see a lot more flexible pouches. They're absolutely not recyclable at all. As you know, when you hold your water bottle, they're about 35% thinner than they used to be. So things weigh a lot less. Even glass weighs less. It's thinner, interestingly enough. What do these changes mean? And this is something we don't give credit for. I look to a city on the West Coast that just has great data, really, really good data. I use them a lot because their data is so good. Between 2010 and 2015, their population of the city increased by 9%. In that same time frame, their overall waste generation decreased by 6%, which means that in one 5-year period, their waste generation decreased by 20% per household. Now, that's the right story. I mean, that is waste reduction. That's exactly what we should be doing. But we don't even talk about it. You don't hear about that. And to me, that's what it's all about, looking at the waste reduction and looking at less of it, as opposed to focusing on these really high recycling rates. Which then, this next slide really kind of amplifies the problem that we've got. The same community, consultants who've been doing work looking at the waste stream for 20 years in the same community, so the same methodology, same locations, doing everything the same, between 2000 and 2010, as they measured the material in the recycling stream, they saw that it increased by 8% by weight, but the volume increased by 37%. So that lighter material I talked about is exactly what you're seeing here. And what I sometimes get frustrated by, there's a lot of talk about recycling being stagnant. Baloney. It's not stagnant. I bet you all know that. When you look at what you're recycling in your own homes, in your own communities, at your own companies, it just weighs less. It's more voluminous and it weighs less. We're recycling more than ever. So, as cities have been trying to achieve these really high recycling rates, they have these desperate efforts to try to add material because it's getting lighter, so they want to try to reach these weight-based recycling goals. So they're adding all this really crazy stuff to their programs. What's happening, we've got a lot more complex plastics, a lot more complex materials. Customers are really confused. They put their stuff in the recycling bin, hoping that we can figure out how to recycle it. We call it wish cycling. And it shows up at our plants, and we have a lot more cost that goes into getting it out. And indeed, we have seen our contamination in just 8 years double, 100% more. It cost us in 2015 contamination coming into our facilities from our recycling programs that cost us $60 million, just waste management, one company in 1 year. So it's really been, I talk about collaboration. We're working any way we can to try to help folks understand how to recycle the right things better. So this is a slide, I found this study a couple of weeks ago, and I hope I can make a point with it. It's not a great slide, so listen to me versus spend too much time trying to figure it out. So Ontario, Canada does a really good job with their recycling. They've got a lot of great programs. And this researcher there looked at what was happening in the province. And he noted that they'd seen an increase in weight between 2002 and 2014 of about 15%, roughly, in weight. But the cost increase for recycling in the province had increased by 63% in that same time change. And that's adjusted for inflation. So, there's a lot of question about why is that? Is it inefficiency? Is it lightweighting? What is it? So he dug a level further. And he created two categories of material. He created the non-core And the core. And the core material is the traditional stuff we talked about, paper, bottles, cans, et cetera. The non-core are the plastic laminates, it's the thermoforms, different kinds of plastics, polystyrene, cartons, aseptic packaging. And he analyzed them separately. And what he found was by adding these non-core materials to the recycling container, it increased the cost of the entire program so dramatically, but while only increasing the recycling diversion by a very small amount. So the environmental benefit of adding these much more complex materials was very small, very little benefit to it, but very high cost associated. I think that's a really important takeaway for us in the United States to be thinking about. And I'm going to talk in my next couple of slides about the pressure that and you heard me earlier, the pressure that the industry's under. We're under a lot of pressure to find ways to be more efficient with what we're doing, which means that we need to find the places to achieve the best environmental benefits at the lowest price. So as we get pressure to add more materials to the programs, we need to look and kind of have that one of those talks of, is it really going to add to the cost of the whole system relative to the environmental benefit for us? So I think I mentioned this earlier. We've seen a lot of different pressures on our industry. About a third of the material that we recycle goes to China. And they're a global market. And as their economy has slowed down from about 14% to 6% or so, there is less demand that they have for product in China. So it's really lowered the demand and lowered the pricing. We have had times we've been at about 45% less commodity value for the recyclables that are coming out of our plants over the last couple of years. That's not expected to change. We have low energy prices, which means that it's easier for resin producers to use virgin resin than post-consumer recycled resin, so the value and the pricing of plastics has fallen dramatically as well. Metal prices are depressed globally. The strong US dollar is great, but it makes our material more expensive on the global market, less attractive for the international market to buy our recyclables. So in general, we are entering our 5th year of depressed commodity prices, which means that when we're going to sell product, it's got to be really, really good quality. So I talked about the contamination doubling. At the same time, the demand has been shrinking, so it's increased our cost and it's decreased the revenue out the back end. So it's really created some pressures, which is why we've had to be so efficient and focus so much energy, why you hear us talking about recycling a lot. And I guess what it's done is made us realize we're at a crossroads. And really our whole industry has been talking about it and realized that, again, this isn't probably a cycle as much as it is a shift and a linear change, that we need to be thinking about changing how we're looking at things. We can keep trying to kind of bang our heads against the wall doing things the same way we've been doing it, or we can look differently and look at the materials that we're managing in a completely different way. So to do that, I'm not going to go through the details of this, but I think if you can visualize what this does, this is an EPA, a U.S. Environmental Protection Agency slide that they put together to help amplify the impact of materials across the entire value chain. When we talk about recycling goals by weight, we're just looking at the back. I don't know if I have a thing here. We're just really looking at this. We miss all of the energy embodied and the waste embodied in the entire supply chain. So what EPA has encouraged us to do is to take a life cycle look at the materials that we're managing. Stop focusing just on end-of-life management. Look at the materials in the waste stream all the way through. Use life cycle assessment to make decisions on how we manage material. So this has been a really important message for us, and one that I think it's catalytic, and we're seeing cities and states start to understand how important it is to shift this way of thinking all the way through the system. So I use this, and many of you have probably seen it, but I'm going to use it because it works. It's an example that EPA put together on coffee containers. So if you look at the top, you'll see your traditional old school metal can of coffee. They're all the same, hold the same amount of coffee, by the way, all of these. Then the second one is a rigid plastic container of coffee, and the third one is a non-recyclable flexible pouch. So when you do the life cycle assessment of each of these, in terms of the packaging, what you find is, and this assumes regular recycling rates for the metal and the plastic, and no recycling of the laminate at the bottom. What you find is that there's a 400% energy benefit by using the non-recyclable film pouch, and a 1,000% benefit in greenhouse gas emissions by using the non-recyclable pouch, because it uses so much less raw material. And that's really what recycling is all about. So I guess the message I can like to convey with this is we need to stop and think about that old belief of if recycling is good, then recycling more is better. We need to start using life cycle assessment to look at the materials in the stream and make those decisions about what is the best. Recycling is one tool in the toolbox. What we're really trying to get to is the environmental benefit. And so making the decisions on materials based on that broader environmental benefit is really important, I think, as we're challenged with a waste stream that's really shifting to much more of these non-recyclable materials. So, sustainable materials management, the concept of using life cycle thinking to look at the materials that we manage, is actually right now being implemented in the state of Oregon. And I like this. I've got a couple of slides that are examples that come from Oregon, and I think they're really great for helping to understand how we can tactically implement this and why it doesn't have to be so complicated. So this slide, I just love. It's great. So they put this, the state uses this to explain what they're doing and why they're doing it. This is basically a graph that shows a ton of these 5 different commodities of glass, aluminum, plastic, PET, asphalt, and carpet. And it's worthless. It doesn't do anything. All it does is it shows you what a ton of a ton of a ton. It doesn't show you any environmental attributes associated with these materials. So let's look at these same 5 materials after you've applied life cycle thinking to them to look at the greenhouse gas emission benefit associated with recycling those materials. Look at that. It's a lot different. So what they're doing is using life cycle assessment to look at the materials in their waste stream to then set priorities of things that they're going to focus on and recycle. And so from this, then they created new goals. They have a whole set of goals. Oregon already has a lot of really great things that they're doing. This is why you don't see aluminum up there. They have a bottle bill. They're recycling aluminum at a really high level already. But what they could do then is use their life cycle analysis, and they could say, you know what? We can do a lot for the environment at a broad level by targeting carpet, food, and plastics, and that's exactly what they're doing. So kind of along the same lines, waste management about a year ago. This is something I am really excited about. We've been working on it for about a year. We decided we wanted to look at the greenhouse gas emission impact of our entire services, everything that we do. So we used EPA data, US EPA data, and we used the United States EPA's WARM life cycle tool. So we wanted to make sure that we would be as transparent as possible, and we applied that to the services that we provide in our entire sector. And then after we did, and we created then greenhouse gas emissions associated with each of the services that we provide. And then when we were done with that, we looked at the cost of providing those services so we could kind of do a McKinsey abatement curve model for just our services, our sector alone, which has never been done before, believe it or not. It's very hard for anybody to do, especially when you're going to apply the cost to it. So what we found was this, and what's nice about it is it's very much collaborated by EPA, and by Oregon's been doing some of this work as well. We've been pressure testing it along the way, working collaboratively with others so that we could make this a useful tool. I think a little bit of what as you talked about with Merck, to be honest. So what we found was by recycling, this is traditional residential curbside recycling, and here's commercial recycling. If we just recycle all the material, it ends up being 32% of the waste stream. All the traditional recyclables that are out there, which if you do that, it's about 32% of the waste stream. We get 84% of the greenhouse gas emission benefit of the entire sector just by doing those things right. About a half a dozen things really, really well. We get 84% of the benefit of that sector. Then once we start to talk about additional materials, food, yard waste, getting deeper into the stream, investing in really in technologies, The benefits are incremental. They're very much smaller benefits, but at a very, very high cost. So this is, I guess, the only point, the biggest point for this is when we can be laser focused on making sure if we have priorities, if we have limited resources, making sure we're doing the traditional recycling really, really well, getting it all out, we can see really great environmental benefits by doing that. So we're pretty excited about this. So I'm going to wrap up, and I'll have a couple minutes for questions if you have any, by circling back kind of to the idea of setting the right goals. So again, if recycling 32% of the waste stream can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 84% without breaking the bank, that's really where that sweet spot is in terms of investment, shouldn't we be focusing on recycling those materials? Also, should we be following Oregon's lead by analyzing specific materials to create very surgical strategic programs that can have the greatest benefits to our own organizations as well as the communities in which we live. You know, technologies are continuing to change fast. I think the cycles will get tighter, and we have a very infrastructure heavy industry that we belong in. It's going to be very, very hard for us to keep up with some of those cycles as they change. So like now, I think is the really good time for us to be using the knowledge that we have to use life cycle thinking to create goals and programs that maximize the broader environmental benefits, looking across the life cycle all the way through to make sure that we're managing the value stream and the value chain to the maximum benefit that we can. That's what I've got, and I'd be happy to answer questions if folks have them. I know it's a lot, so thank you for your patience and attention. Happy to answer questions. Let's see, you in the back went up first.
Thanks. It was very good. I like the idea of rethinking the way we approach things. I feel your pain also on recycling, having been in that business. I wondered if you could comment a little bit on the U.S. Business Council, the Sustainability Business Council is trying to use big data to create markets for waste. And a couple of cities, Austin has done it, for example, and Ohio is doing it now. I wonder if you could comment, do you think that will help spur innovation as far as more people knowing the types of things that are out there and putting a value on them?
I think that's a great question. And I think about this a lot because I think we're in a period, I almost have to think about it differently than I did 5 years ago, and I'll tell you why. Recyclables are global commodities, right? So we have found in some places, you've seen investments in plastics recycling to try to get local plastics recycling. And quite frankly, it's a global commodity market. So when the resin prices go down, oil prices go down, those businesses go out of business pretty quickly. So as I say that, though, some things aren't global. Organics are not global. They're very local and regional. Glass tends to be more regional and local. We don't have as much global movement of glass. And also, the reason I say I have a different lens to this than I would have 5 years ago is as that waste stream changes and we have a completely different stream of material, I think we're going to have to think differently. Some of those materials may not be recyclable. So let's talk about Ohio in specific. Ohio, there have been some really interesting technologies around pyrolysis around plastics. So a lot of the packaging that we're seeing right now is the environmental cost to recycle it may be greater than the benefit, but turning it into oil may be a better solution for us. So we have to challenge our age-old thinking. Recycling may not be the ultimate best solution for flexible film. Turning it into oil may be an energy may be a better solution. So I think as long as we can be open to looking at things from a different lens than we did before, I think that's exactly what we need to be doing, and it's something we've been missing for the last couple of decades.
As a fellow West Coast transplant, I very much appreciated seeing the West Coast green. You actually just in your response touched on something with my question. So with the contaminated waste streams that you're seeing, it seems like it's almost a funny example of a good problem to have, where in this case, behavior change has surpassed the technology. And usually in this sector, behavior change is sort of one of the hardest things to accomplish. So what you're seeing with the wish cycling or wish streaming that you called it is people think like they want that to recycle. So they're actually trying to recycle more than we can actually recycle. So I was wondering, basically, and this is where you touched on, is like, we have to think outside the box of turning into oil, is there a way to be able to at least maintain the success and achievements of that behavior change? Because I remember in the 80s, you know, being in California, like, about recycling, and that's really embedded that habit in the culture. Not losing those gains in behavior change and cultural norms of sustainability, while still doing something with the things that are entering the stream that at this moment, there isn't a technology to deal with them.
So your question's a complicated one, and I have this tension. I think this is a tension that's not going to go away. So the problem is when you get that material, right now the cost to do something with it is so great, it drives the cost of the program up, and many communities aren't willing to bear that cost. So where we're putting our energy right now is basically community-based social marketing around educating folks to know how to recycle more of the right thing. We're doing a lot more work with our drivers on the routes to help educate consumers. And then I think over time we have to be open to those changes to understand as we need to keep working on that technology to handle that material, because we are going to see more of it. Contamination, unfortunately, is expected to probably increase, not decrease. So we need to find solutions for it. But the concern we have is if we try to tackle it now, we will drive the cost of the programs up to a point where many communities won't be able to afford to maintain them. So we have a little bit of a tension there, and I think right now what we've said is we need to get the quality right because when markets are down, and then we can at the same time be focusing on those solutions, so when the time's right, we'll have the ability to implement those other solutions. Okay, I think I'm out of time. I'll be around for a little bit, though, if anybody has other questions, and thank you very much.